Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Visible Mending webinar. Ollie and Amanda, do you want to hop on and we'll get this sewing, patching, darning party started?
Hello.
So my name's Theron. I'm from the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District, and I'm the outreach coordinator there. We are in the second week of our sustainability series of webinars about different skills to help you be more sustainable and reduce your waste and things like that. So let's start out by thanking the USDA Rural Utility Service for grant funding to help us put on this series. And Amanda and Ollie, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Go for it, Amanda.
Yeah, so I'm Amanda Clement. I am the AmeriCorps member for the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District this year.
And I'm Ollie Cultrara. My pronouns are they, them. I'm located in Vermont, and I was a previous AmeriCorps member at the Addison County Solid Waste Management District.
All right, so a couple of quick things about the webinar. We'll be taking questions in the Q&A box. You can type those in and Amanda will pass those along. If you have any suggestions or comments, please feel free to put those in the chat box. And if you have any questions that you'd like to say in person or say, we may be able to unmute you and just let you ask it later on. So with that, let's get started. Ollie, do you want to take us away?
Sure.
Okay.
So I have to say, this is so cool to see people from all over the country and the world. And I'm sure many of you have some sewing or mending experience that I don't have. So hopefully you can put in your tips and tricks in the chat. I got started with mending because I bought a pair of nice wool socks that I liked a lot. And I can't even remember which pair they are now. But at the time when they sort of wore out a bit, I was frustrated about the fact that I spent so much money on them, but then I had to throw them away. So I decided not to and looked up, fixing socks or patching socks, and really sort of got into this over time, self-taught with YouTube and various blogs on the internet. And basically there are some things that you could fix and they would look okay, but like they're not going to look like they looked before. And so I really appreciate the movement of people leaning into visible mending, of knowing that your repairs are going to be visible. Might as well make them artistic and creative. So we'll just jump right in. So Theron, if you could launch our poll, we're going to ask a little bit about your sewing experience, just so I have a sense of where you're coming from.
Yeah. Here we go. This is the poll. Okay, we are getting up there. I'll share these poll results as soon as we have a good number. Yeah, we're up at 93%. I'm gonna end this polling and share it around. So it looks like most people who are tuned in today say they're okay at sewing. Some of them say they're pretty comfortable with it.
I avoided making horrible sewing puns, but I'm glad to see that most people are so or pretty darn comfortable with sewing. And if you're not, I'm sure there's some great resources on YouTube, and it just takes practice, really. It's simple, but there's some fine motor skills involved in not getting too tangled up. So that is great. Thank you, Theron.
You're welcome.
Now, if you could share in the chat, thank you for laughing at my bad jokes in the chat. If you could share in the chat what you brought to mend, that would also help us get a sense of what you're hoping to fix.
And
share that.
Go ahead.
I have a sweater, a shirt, a button-down shirt, and a pair of socks.
Okay, and while people are sharing, I just want to let people know that we will be recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see that later. We'll send out a link.
Oh, I love the cashmere sweater one. Working previously being in AmeriCorps at the solid waste district, we had a textile recycling bin, and I saved a couple sweaters from there. One of them I'll show you today. One of them was cashmere that I did some more invisible mending on. I just happened to have a thread color that matched the material, so that was serendipitous. Awesome. So a nice variety of I'm not familiar with sashimi style mending, so maybe whoever shared that could share more. But looks like a nice mix of clothing and some sheets and things. Great, so let's just get started. So we already did introductions, but we're going to get into 3 basic mending techniques. I'm getting distracted by the chat. So the first one will be darning, and then patching socks, and then a sort of show through patch. Ooh, the pair of jeans with a tear near the groin area is a tough one. So if anyone has like good tips on that one, especially for less visible solutions to that, I'm all ears. And so as we go, I'm going to do some show and tell. I'm going to switch back and forth between showing you some pictures and doing a bit of a demonstration. And you're welcome to continue putting questions in the Q&A. It's probably easier to find them in the Q&A than the chat at this point. So if you've got questions, we'll hopefully answer them as we go on each technique. And then anytime at the end, we can just spend sewing together, and you can pop your questions in as we go, and we'll try to answer them. And I'm all for crowdsourcing the answers to these because, like I said, self-taught. Just scrolling through one more time with the things in the chat. Great. Oh, a quilt. Nice. All right, so darning, and Darren, you're seeing my screen okay, right?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Darning is basically making your mending part of the fabric. You're not adding on a new piece of fabric. You're basically recreating it to some extent. So the first step is to sew threads back and forth in parallel lines across the hole. And you want to make sure you're doing that on reaching both edges of the hole and anchoring your thread in the intact fabric. And then you're going to sew in the opposite direction, perpendicular to the first set of threads. And then you're going to weave over and under the threads that you started with to basically weave a new piece of material in the hole. So here's a little diagram of the steps. So starting way over on the side, you're going to go back and forth, doing several rows off on one side of the hole, and then just crossing the hole with a big long stitch when you're over it, and then anchoring on the other side. And then you can switch and go the other way. This diagram is showing that they're not doing as much overlap on both sides, so you have a lot of leeway there, and that can be part of your artistic decision of where you want there to be overlap and what colors to use. And it is a little bit tricky. The opening is, there's nothing really holding it open unless you form it around something. So something like a darning egg, they're called. This one was my grandmother's, but I didn't learn how to darn from her. And I often use a glass bottle with a rubber band to hold my material taut. You could also, not so much for darning, but with other techniques, you could use an embroidery hoop if you have one, but I don't. So here's some inspiration. Just searching visible mending, you get lots of different results. So you can see how people are making choices about how much overlap they want. Either you can have all of your weaving be completely in line, or like in this bottom right corner, you can go way beyond in one direction and then the other, and you have a couple of different options. So this is one of my first attempts in the top left, and you can see how it's kind of tough. That's where the hole is to get it taut. So clearly these people have a lot of practice. So don't be discouraged if it takes you several tries to get it to look nice. You have to keep it pretty even and have a fair density of sort of stitches. And I use embroidery floss for this. I think There's probably some other kind of yarn types that would work well, but A, it comes in lots of great colors, and B, it's like a nice thickness to be able to work with easily, that you don't have to do so many stitches. It's not as thin as just regular sewing thread, such that it doesn't take you 10 years, but at the same time, it's not so coarse that it would, when it's touching your skin, it would be really rough. So I have, like I mentioned, a sweater that I rescued from the textile recycling. And I need to move the chat so you can see my video. And I'm going to adjust down here. Great, I think that might be as good as it can get for now. So this is a sweater that I rescued from the textile recycling that had tons of moth holes in it, and I've been practicing. I think this was my first attempt. That was pretty loose. And I've been practicing with 2 contrasting colors for most of these holes, just so that I can see what I'm doing pretty well. And then the inside, you can really see where the hole is fairly small. That's the hole, but that I've anchored around the edges. And Theron or Amanda, feel free to just hop right in with questions because there's so many going by that I'm missing them all. So I prepared, trying to get this to focus for you. Come on. This yesterday, you can more or less see that there are red threads going in this direction, and I'm going in this direction with my slightly less thread. I thought I'd have more contrast for you to see, but so I'm going back and forth across the hole, and I'm about to actually start the weaving of the open part of the hole. Amanda, any questions for us?
Yeah, so we had some questions about knotting when you're darning, how many knots do you have to put in?
It probably depends on the fabric that you're starting with. I assume that like knots as in like just anchoring your thread to begin with? Maybe
yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I use a quilting knot where you take your needle and you wrap the tail end around a couple times and then you slide it off the needle past the end of the thread. But you could use whatever knot works for you. This sweater is pretty stretchy and has pretty, fairly loose for a commercial knit fabric. So I make sure the knot is pretty chunky just so it doesn't slide through. But just a nice fat knot. It's going to be messy on the inside. So as long as it holds up, that's what you're looking for. So like, as you can see, I just have the red threads going parallel across the hole for now, and that's where I'm about to start. So I'm going to grab my bottle, and it's also sometimes helpful to have a rubber band to hold it on. So I'm going to put this underneath my sewing so that I can, losing my needle, stretch it around here, and then I use the rubber band to just hold it in place, and I have to rescue my needle from that. So now I'm going to be going over and under, and unlike those beautiful sample pictures I showed you from the internet, I'm not doing so great of a job of keeping my threads above the surface. So the red ones are going this way, these pink ones are going this way. But if I were doing a better job, sort of, I would want longer stitches on the surface and then shorter ones underneath so that I could really show the weaving pattern a bit better. But we're doing what I can. It's also helpful if you have a needle that is a little bit, they're probably called embroidery needles or something, a little bit more blunt. Oops, I accidentally tied a knot in my thread. Than what I'm using, which is just a regular sewing needle, because that can, you're not working with really fine, might have to cut this off and start again. Yeah, basically having the blunter tip of a needle means that you're not getting it caught so much in the little fuzzy threads, and you can just focus on the like big pieces of embroidery floss that you're working with. I also haven't actually darned socks because I think that the texture would be a little bit too rough on my foot, and I've only been doing it on sort of sweaters and things, and I've preferred to patch my socks, which I will show you later. I see the question about, is it better to work on the right side? I do, so that I can see what it's going to look like when I'm done. Because I don't really care what the back side looks like. Okay, maybe we're unknotted. Yes, thanks, Lynn. I will hold my examples a bit longer, especially because it doesn't focus very well. Oh, I like Rachel's tip about it's okay to start without a knot, leave a long tail, and weave the start in later. I start mending with the hole or around the hole first. Let me get untangled and then zoom out and show you again. So the hole is where this darker, there we go, red spot is. It's pretty tiny, this one that I'm working on. So I started in a corner and I went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for like about a centimeter before I even got to the edge of the hole. And then, oh, sorry, I was going this way first, back and forth. And then looks like 5 stitches across the hole, and then another centimeter with another 5-ish rows on the other side. So I start away from the edge of the hole because this fabric is all intact and this is where the hole is. So I make sure that I'm weaving into the intact fabric first so that I'm not tugging on the frayed ends or edges of the hole, and trying to use that for structure. Any other relevant questions?
Just kind of about like what materials are best for darning.
Yeah, I've enjoyed working with this. It's not super fine, but it's definitely finer than I could knit by myself. It seems like the sort of width of a column of knitting is about the same as the embroidery floss. So I feel like it matches nicely texture-wise, but I think you could do trial and error. I think if you're using a really fine woven fabric that you're darning into, it's just going to look like there's going to be a little bit more contrast in the texture. So it is a little tough actually to do it on a stretchy knit like this. So you could practice on something like a dish towel or a sheet or something. I think a dish towel would be a nice thickness to start with, and not too slippery or stretchy.
And then we had a question of how many strands of embroidery floss do you use?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was trying to remember it last night when I was setting up this sample. This is the full 6 strands. I'm fairly certain that I've done other projects, I think on a button-down shirt that was a finer cloth, where I took out some of the strands and did 3 or 2 or something, probably 3. So about half. So it's hard to hold this into the camera while I'm doing it, but let me try to do 1 row across so you can see what it looks like when I get to over the hole. Over, under, over, under. And like you might imagine, it's okay if it's not perfect. So there we are. I'm crossing across the hole for one of the first times, and I am going over, under, and then I'm going to pull through. You don't want to pull it so tight that you're shrinking the fabric, but you want it taut enough that it's not going to get all wiggly like my other example, gold sort of colored example I showed you. You can use the needle to sort of pack it in there. I'm sure there's weaving terms that I could be using to describe what I'm doing, but you all can put that in the chat. Under, oops, over. And then I don't have a great technique for changing directions other than making sure I'm anchoring into the fabric. I know I'm blocking what I'm doing right now. And then coming back. Should have done a blue thread or something so we could see it better. Alas, I wanted this one to be red. So this is my practice sweater that I'm really just making very colorful with all of my practice holes. All right, any more darning questions? Otherwise, I think we should probably move on.
Yep, all the questions we have at the moment are all about patching, so we'll cover those later.
Great. All right. I wish this focused a little better. I need one of those fancy cameras that YouTubers have. I have much more appreciation now for people who like show me how to knit and stuff on YouTube. They have good patience and high quality cameras. Cool. All right. So, no pun intended. Let me go back to my screen share. So that was our darning demo. And now we're on to patching socks. Oops, I didn't share it. There we go. Seeing that now? Okay, turn off my video for a second. So patching socks. This one is how I got started, and it's really satisfying to save a pair of socks that you really like. As you can see in the picture on the left, they have a couple different pieces of fabric that they sewed around the heel. And I will say the heels where my socks wear out the most, but also sometimes the ball of the foot or the outside sort of knuckle of my pinky toe. And those are pretty curved areas of your foot. And you do want to be careful to, let me see if I can get this full screen to work better. You want to keep in mind the curve of the sock and the curve of your patch so that it lies as flush as possible with the natural shape of the sock and your foot so it doesn't rub in your shoe too much. I was a little concerned when I got started doing this that I was going to be creating a real bump in my shoe that was going to be really uncomfortable. And I found that happens sometimes if you're not careful, but mostly it does a good job of, once you wear it one or two times, sort of blending in with the rest of the sock and not feeling like a bump that's too big. And then another strategy I use is when I'm doing anything down at the ball of my foot, I try to make sure that the patch ends in that sort of crevice between the ball of your foot and the pads of your toes, so that the sort of ridge pressure point of the edge of the patch is not on the curve. It's sort of in a recess in your foot. I find that makes it more comfortable. So let's get some closer up examples. So this person is very deliberately, looks like it's wearing out here, and maybe they're leaving the black part of the heel that is the original sock. And so they've cut a curved piece that helps fit to the contour of the sock. And they are using a sort of form inside to help work against. And again, this is where I use a glass jar a lot of the time, although if you had something more foot shaped, that would probably be more useful depending on where in the sock you are patching. It helps to have the approximate shape of the foot inside so that you can see how to sort of contour the patch around it. And I usually use this overcast or overhand stitch, as I will demonstrate. I think this running stitch they're just using basically as a method of pinning the fabric on before they come back and do that overcast stitch in both directions to really secure it into place. I found that I have one pair I've had patched for a while, and eventually some of this thread got worn off by just walking on it. But the patch is mostly still there, so I'm able to just sew it back on. No big deal. So that was a pretty quick overview, but I will stop sharing my screen again and show you my sock. Okay. So once again, big fan of these glass bottles for doing stuff. So here is a sock that I'd already patched the heel, and I actually cut the heel off of another sock that has that natural curve in it to do the heel. And now the bottom is wearing out. So this is pretty much the center of the ball of my foot. And sort of the edges. So I want the patch to, I think if I were to just patch this part and end right here, that would be pretty much in the middle of the ball of my foot, and that's not going to be super comfortable. And having overlapping seams like I did here can be a little rough. So I'm going to try to do one big patch from another sock that is going to come right here, which is when I put my sock on, I made sure to test that that's about in between. It's like if your hand was a foot, it's right here. So not the ball of your foot and not the pads of your toes. It's that little sort of valley in the middle. So I'm gonna sew across here. I'm gonna come all the way around and try to gather that whole area. So you wanna be careful with the worn out spot. Like I don't wanna sew too close to it because it's really thin. So I wanna make sure I'm sewing into the intact part of the sock. So I've got set up here. I took another lone sock that had some worn spots in it, and a friend gave it to me because she didn't want to patch it. So I just am cutting out, I cut out a big section from the top of the foot that was a pretty continuous flat part of the sock that had, I did dip down onto the sides a bit to get that curve because it's going to hold sort of the bottom of the sock like this. And I want it to come up a little bit on the edges. So this is over a bottle and not a foot, but I made sure to check that I was lining up this edge with, like I said, that valley between the ball of your foot and your toes. And then, oh, I might be causing another hole by stretching it out too much, but I'll go back and fix that. So I've pinned, you sort of see the pins, this patch on around all of those worn out spots. I think I cut the patch a little small, so I had to stretch it out a bit, but it's also stretched over a bottle more than it would be over my foot. Ooh, I like Jess's idea of using a knit fabric like a sweatshirt or a t-shirt material. That's really clever. I've mostly used socks that I've lost the other one of, in part because it's easier to find a sort of curved piece to use to replace the heel for those areas. But if it's just a flat spot, then I think a t-shirt or a sweater could work really well. So keep saying so, and then it makes me think of a joke. All right, I started here. I just did a regular knot that I tucked in behind and did an overcast stitch all the way up to this curve. And now I am trying to line up. Sometimes if I'm at the very toe of the sock, I'll line up the edge of the bottle with that so that I can sort of mimic the shape of my foot, but I'm still actually on the flat part of my foot right now. This is where the toe would be. So very simply just doing that overcast, overhand stitch. I don't know what other people call it. For whatever reason, my brain wants to call it an overhand stitch, but maybe that's an overhand knot I'm thinking about. So this is where it can be tricky to have your thread be long enough to get all the way around without getting tangled up. So feel free to cut a smaller piece of thread and do more than one. And I usually, when I'm doing socks, I usually totally just double up my thread and tie knot at the end so I don't have to worry about it pulling through the needle. So, and I find that the doubled up thread probably helps a little bit with durability because this is rubbing around in my shoe. So I didn't always used to pin my patches on, but it's just useful, just helpful. I'm oftentimes a lazy sewer. Doesn't like to pin or measure things, but it's helpful. You can maybe see a little bit of the green highlighter I used yesterday when I was cutting out the patch to make sure it was big enough. I think I was probably holding it on my foot. So these could be a great gift for somebody who's lamenting that they have to throw away their nice socks. I have to say, most of the ones I've patched are not Darn Tough brand, which tend to last longer. Although they don't really get holes as much as just sort of wear into a thin spot, which still can cause blisters if it's rubbing your shoe. Any questions about patching socks?
Yeah, so we have one question about what type of thread you're using to patch work on socks.
I think I have it right here. Whatever this is, regular sewing thread. There's probably names for it, but whatever I have in my sewing kit, it's not anything fancy.
Right.
You probably don't want to use the cheapest thread that you might find in one of those like hotel room sewing kits because you want it to not wear out with rubbing.
Yeah. And we have a question about how do you keep the edges of the patch from fraying?
It's actually not been an issue. I think partially that it's knit, the knit fabric that I'm using in the first place, and partially that the overhand stitch sort of holds the edge right down onto the fabric. it's a little, you know, unfinished, but it's not, it's nice that it's not rolled over or hemmed or anything, because like you said, that would create a bump. And also I find that raw edge actually, especially if you have a more plush sock than this one's pretty thin, that raw edge blends in nicely with the sock underneath to sort of create a smoother transition. So I actively don't do anything about that. Jess, I see your point about Darn Tough's lifetime warranty, and I feel too possessive of the socks I have. I can't send them back. So, oh, good question about which socks to use for spare parts. Well, so far I've only used socks to create patches if I've lost their mate. So I wait a while and sadly hope that it will turn up, and if it doesn't, then I'll turn it into patches. But I'm just based on which of my socks I like better. If I didn't have a choice, I just ask around. I only patch wool socks. I pretty much only wear wool socks now, but you could probably use non-wool socks as a patch, and I'm sure it would work fine, but I'm just, you know, persnickety about it. Yeah, I see that note in the chat about the wool socks and sort of wool felt. I kind of do feel like it does some maybe minor felting action, because it really blends in more nicely than I ever expected it would.
So Ollie, I have this piece of wool fabric that I have been using just right now. And I kind of tried to cut it in a shape that's sort of like an eye to fit over the whole heel patch. I don't know. I haven't tried it out yet, but I'll report back.
Yeah, definitely do. I've tried, like, I once tried to patch, a friend gave me a sock that, like, her big toe, the bottom of her big toe or the top, actually, like the top, like the end of her big toenail, it's where it really wore on her sock. Yep. Okay. And like, so I tried to make a patch that would curve over the end, like a little toe cap.
Yep.
And I had to, like, I did one big piece of fabric, and then I cut a couple slits in places where it really had to curve a lot so that it could bend a little bit more easily. Again, there's probably like technical sewing terms for these things, but yeah, trial and error. And honestly, if you do a bad job and it's not comfortable, just get your seam ripper out, and if you have one, or, you know, a small pair of scissors, and it's really just easy to snip out those threads. All right, so if there aren't any major questions about that, then we'll move on. I feel like I'm on a cooking show.
Yep, no, I think we can move on.
Great. All righty. Now I need to share my screen again. Great. So the last one I have today is the show through patch, and I feel like this is where it gets really pretty, and you don't necessarily have to have excellent sewing skills, because you can pick a fun fabric for your patch and then just attach it on, and it looks really cool. This is the one that I did. This is a flannel shirt, and I think that was the way to go. It looks like I've seen a lot of examples. These are all jeans. I feel like jeans and flannel that are a little bit thicker just seem to be a little bit easier to manipulate the fabric, because the example I'll show you next is I'm doing a button-down shirt with a piece of woven fabric, and they're kind of slippery and hard to manage. So different options for what you do with the edges. You can leave the edge raw, like on the jeans or on my flannel shirt here, which, you know, just for the aesthetic that you're looking for, or you can trim a little bit extra around your hole and fold it under and basically hem it in on itself. This heart one I found on a blog where they put little slits in the jeans fabric all along the edges so that when they tucked it in, it could really curve nicely. And then you just have to be careful while you're pinning to make sure you've got all those tucked in edges. So different options for how you secure it and what kind of thread colors you might use to accent onto your fabric. So well, maybe not obviously, but these patches they extend pretty far out, and so they're really anchoring into the intact fabric. I'll show you the inside of this one. it extends way past the hole, and these stitches are really, probably on these jeans, they're going farther than they need to, but it's both for an accent and just to anchor it in place nicely, especially if you're not hemming the edge, because you don't want too much stress on these inside threads that are going to continue to deteriorate the edge. I will say I've done this in like pretty visible parts of the shirt. I wouldn't necessarily put this on a part of something that's going to get a lot of wear, because I think that these threads could get worn out and then sort of detach, but I think that would take some serious working. I have seen someone repair their farming work pants with this kind of method and it seemed to hold up fine. So good question, Joan. I don't know what that is, so you should tell me more about what Shishiko stitches are or look it up. So let's switch over to a demo, and still got my sock remnants here. So this is the shirt that I patched, and this was an example of like a pretty decent sized hole that I could have fixed, and it's right on the front of the shirt. I'm not really sure what my other options would have been other than making it visible, so I decided to really lean into it and make it very visible. So this is a tiny little hole. I didn't want to get any bigger, and then this was a more sizable hole that I think I may have trimmed a little bit on the edges just to make it more square, but mostly just left it how it was. So here's the inside. This tiny little, oh, that's bright. Come on. Maybe. Okay, my lighting doesn't like me right now. It's a tiny little pinprick hole that you can barely see. Let's see if this pin will help it. It's the size of maybe the end of a pencil, but probably a little smaller than that. I just didn't want it to grow, so I put this patch over it, and just a raw edge on the inside with the patch. And there's 3 concentric rows of, wow, that light is bright. Let me try adjusting. Let's see if that works any better. Just the midday light. I tried to make sure that I overlapped. So there's 3 rows, and you don't touch the middle where the hole is at all with the thread. You really just make sure you have plenty of space, and I didn't hem or anything there. So I think when I did this, I could have done a little bit of a better job doing this on a flat surface. The patch actually bubbles out a little bit, which you can barely tell at all, but it doesn't lie totally flat. So it's one method. And ooh, mending with wax dental floss. I've done that while hiking when I had to. Works really well. It's very strong. I've also done some bookmaking where you wax your thread. So if you're doing something that really needs it to be really durable, or you're working with a really coarse fabric where like just running the thread through the fabric many times is going to sort of fray it, you can wax your thread or use dental floss. That's a great idea. It's really strong because it's basically plastic. How do you get the patches flat if the patch is on a pocket? I think you'll have to maybe show me what you mean, Rebecca. My pocket's pretty flat. I guess maybe you mean the pocket of pants or something. It's a great question. Trial and error is what I'll say. Again, you could, if you really screwed this up, you could just get a seam ripper in there and try again. So I decided to do concentric circles. You could also sort of stitch outwardly, kind of like rays of sunshine. I liked, you could do a different shape than the hole. You could trim the hole into a different shape, or yeah, lots of different options. The internet is your friend in terms of inspiration. And on a shirt, awkward getting your hand inside. Totally. Yeah. If anyone wants to chime in and help out Rebecca with that question, I wonder if maybe patching over it would be, because you could do a similar thing where your patch just is on the outside and you're doing some visible mending. The raw edge would just be the patch and not the hole at that point, and maybe that would still look cool. I'm not sure. So this is the shirt I'm working on. It's a pretty silky button-down shirt. The hole was actually, there's a matching one on the other sleeve, just a straight up rip across on the elbow where it wore out. And I decided that I wanted to put a patch in there, and because there's not actually that much space I essentially held the edges together like this, and I trimmed down sort of to make a, not a half circle, but a half ellipse. And then when I opened it up, it became an ellipse. And that is the shape that you see here. And like I mentioned, it was a little tricky to do the pinning because it's kind of slippery fabric. But here is what the inside looks like. Took me a couple tries to pin it on such that the patch would completely overlap the hole with a good amount of space on each side. And my first row of stitching is right here. And then I'm removing the pins as I go. So I am just going around. Actually, I need another hard surface for this. Let me pull a thing out of my sock. Okay, so once more with the kombucha bottle. This one I didn't find that I really needed a rubber band for. I can just hold it on pretty easily. Where'd my needle go? Down here. So I might move this needle, the pin out of the way, and just just like that. Oops. So Amanda, I knew that we had some patching questions earlier on. Do we want to take those now?
Yeah. So we just had a question about if you find that the edges of the hole on the outside catch on things.
I haven't noticed that so far. It probably would depend on how far from the edge of the hole that you did your first row of stitches. I think I noticed on some of the, and we can go back to that slide in a second, demos that people did sort of an overcast stitch around the edge, and then they did whatever fancy stuff they wanted to do, which probably would help it catch even less. But I did this pretty close to the edge, so there's not much to catch on. But yeah, I think you would want to be careful about, I think probably the first row you want to think of as like keeping that raw edge close in, and then the other rows after that maybe would be more about reinforcing the patch structurally into the intact fabric around it. Good point about the beeswax in your sewing kit, and that's also true. That does help keeping it from tangling because it kind of makes the thread stiffer.
And one of the first questions we had was about someone patching a sheet, and she wants to know if there's anything that she can do to keep the tear from running.
I found that, well, you might, if it's just like a plain tear, like I showed you in this, whoopsie, scenario, I think that it's possible that the fact that I trimmed around it really helped, because if something catches here, it's really putting all the strain on those ends, and it's going to keep ripping this way. But the fact that I trimmed out the whole circle means that there's no pointy spots that are getting more stress than others. I think that probably distributes it better. And again, like the heart example with the jeans, you could take the torn edge and fold it under, and then have a cleaner edge on your patch. And if you're going to do a circle like that, you would need to make little cuts sort of radiating outward from the edge for maybe 0.5 centimeter, and then tuck those little flaps underneath to have a clean sort of hemmed edge in there. You could also try, if it's just a sheet, you could put a patch on both sides. So lots of options.
The other thing I would add to that is the direction of the tear is going to, it's going to want to tear at the corners. So right. If you go perpendicular to the tear at each of the corners, kind of like you'd see at the bottom of a pocket on a pair of pants, that's a good way to reinforce that.
Yeah. Ooh, Lori's got a good question about patching a quilt and not going through to the other side. gonna guess it depends on how thick the batting is in the middle and what the quilting is like, because you could potentially like seam rip out some of the quilting to give yourself more space between the layers to feel it out with your needle. But if anyone, I've only made 1 or 2 quilts, so if anyone has, and not had to patch them yet, if anyone has any quilting tips in the chat, that would be awesome. Please share.
The last question that we had was someone that just wanted some tips on using iron-on patches or store-bought patches.
Totally. I do know that my mom patched many of my brothers and my pants like that as a kid, and I hope that there are instructions on the patches you bought, because other than ironing them on, I'm not sure. I think you probably want to make sure you're only ironing the patch and the 1 layer of fabric with the hole. So if you can't get your ironing board or whatever surface in there, if it's like too narrow of a pant leg or something, maybe put some cardboard or something in between so that you don't melt the stuff onto. I don't think it really melts through the fabric that much, just to separate the layers of fabric. And then again, maybe I think it could be helpful if you have just a linear tear, again, just to trim it out a little bit, and still have your patch overlap quite a bit. But like Theron and I were saying, like if there are corners or edges to your tear, it's really going to focus the stress there. So having it be a little bit cleaner and rounder might make it a little stronger. Any other experience with iron-on patches is welcome in the chat. So
I've used some iron-on patches, and I find it's helpful to iron them on to stick them in place and then sew them to reinforce it.
Right, good point. And that might be an easier way than pinning something. You iron it on so it's stuck, and then if you wanted to make it pretty after that, you could totally do that with some fancy thread. Great point about the parchment paper and iron-on patches on both sides. My first thought was wax paper, but that sounds like a bad idea. You'd probably get wax on your clothes. Parchment paper sounds much better. So I chose to use white thread because I have a white pattern in here, and I sort of matched the teal of my other patch to the teal thread, but you can be creative. I was thinking about getting fancy and trying to do some sort of radiating stitching that sort of matched the daisy petals, but then I got lazy. So be creative. Maybe be inspired by whatever patching fabric you have. Now you know what to do with all your tiny little scraps of fabric that you're never going to use for anything else. And that's all I've got for demos. We can go back quickly. I feel like I had a point about the some of your patching options. So this is what I mean by they tucked the raw edge under, and they also did that overcast stitch all the way around the edge so that it wouldn't catch on anything, and then they did some concentric circles. And you can kind of see on the jeans, they did a similar thing where they did one perimeter running stitch, and then they did the sort of parallel to the grain of the fabric. So different options there. Other than that, that's all I've got. So if we want to hang out for a little bit and you can sew and we can answer your questions, that works for me.
And I wanted to just show and tell a little bit more. This is a stitcher awl, which I use for leather work, but you can also use this kind of tool to repair something like a backpack strap, because it'll go through that really tough nylon webbing or that kind of material. It'd be good for like jeans too. But basically it's a, there's a needle that you thread, and there's a spool in the back that you load up. It looks like this, but you load it up with your thread, which is usually a wax thread. And you can stitch through pretty much anything. Like you can make, I've used it for like knife sheaths and axe sheaths and stuff like that. This is a pretty crude example, but if you're trying to repair something heavy duty like that, the stitcher awl is a good tool for that.
There, and I might need to borrow that because I have a pair of boots that tore that I'm like pretty sure that cannot be fixed easily, but I'm not really willing to give up yet. So
There is a shoe store that does repairs like that in Barrie. It's called Boisvert or Boisvert. I'm not sure how they pronounce it.
Okay, I went into the like handmade leather shoe maker here, and he was like, "Those are commercial shoes. I can't fix them." I was like, "Okay."
Yeah.
So, and I see what he means. It's like I can't really sew onto the rubber sole very easily. Okay, glad to hear some success stories in the chat. Other things I've repaired when I've been doing things like wind shirts or just various polyester outdoorsy fabrics, I have used a lighter to melt the frayed edges because it just melts and to keep it from tearing more, in addition to sewing it closed or using a patch, but just because that stuff frays like there's no tomorrow. Outerwear patches, stickers. I don't really know. It probably depends on whether it's waterproofy and like, oh, snow pants and stuff. I would say like a sticker iron-on patch is probably a good option for something that you want to be windish or waterproof-ish, because every time you sew things on, like you're punching lots of little holes in it. So I would maybe try a stick-on patch and maybe do both sides and minimize you're sticking a needle into it. But I don't have a lot of experience with that.
The other thing they have for that is it's called seam tape. So oftentimes with like a raincoat, you'll see that on the inside of the seams, there's clear plastic tape that's on there. And I'm not sure if that's ironed on, but it is a way of sealing those seams where you have all the little holes. So if you could get some of that and add that in under your patch, that would probably help for a waterproofing piece of clothing.
I've also done some DIY seam sealing of a tent with like silicone and some solvent. I forget which one the company recommended. It was a little bit toxic and definitely an involved project, but if you're really desperate, best way to patch a torn bed sheet. I think we kind of touched on that in that if it's just a straight rip, you might want to clean up the edges and have more rounded corners of your hole so that there's any tension on the hole isn't concentrated in one area. And then putting your patch on, and basically any patch you want it to overlap your hole by quite a bit. Like this patch goes all the way out to where my fingers are. But I've not done a bed sheet, so anyone else who's done that, maybe depending on where in the sheet and whether it's touching your bare skin, maybe you have preferences about texture of things. If it's a pretty small hole, I think the darning technique would actually work okay in a bed sheet. You just have to have some patience and maybe use a finer thread or just a couple strands of embroidery floss if you're doing embroidery floss. Great questions, everybody.
We have a question wondering if you trim the back of the patch when you're done.
I haven't, but I think depending on maybe if you made it too big to begin with and you decided not to sew all the way out to the edge, I might, so that I'm not catching on it when I slide my hand through the sleeve, but I haven't done that before. I'm, as you maybe have noticed, more of a get the job done kind of sewer and not a make it look really, really nice kind of sewer. So take that with a grain of salt. Maybe I see the person's comment about the cashmere sweater they fixed. Maybe I'll just go grab the sweater that I did and see if the camera can even pick up the repair, because I think it's pretty sneaky. So this is more like invisible mending, but there were two holes pretty much in similar places on the armpit area, and I used 2 different colors of thread, and this one's a little bit lighter, so it shows up a little bit more. But I darned into the sweater, and that's the rough inside. But they were pretty small holes, but it's a pretty fine knit. So this is definitely an example. I can see that I believe I used 3 strands of the embroidery floss instead of all 6. Especially because the knit was finer, and so I think the texture blends in. And it's in an area of the sweater that is pretty much a crease on my body, so it doesn't show up that much anyway, but I was pretty pleased with how that turned out. Let me find the other one. I don't even see it because I did such a good job. Go me. There's the other side, and it's barely visible. It's right here. So that's great. And here's a sweater that I also attempted to do some invisible mending on. It's darker than it looks right now. So these patches, these started out as runs that I just didn't want to get any.
Huh. Well, it looks like Ollie may have been disconnected, but we can give them a chance to get back on. In the meantime, are there any questions we should answer, Amanda?
Yeah, so there's a few people looking for some tips. So Marlo is still looking for the best way to patch a torn bed sheet. So
I think we covered that before, so we can send out the recording of this webinar as soon as we have it up on our YouTube channel. And the other thing, if there are some questions, maybe we can crowdsource them a little bit. If people have suggestions on the best way to do things, go ahead and type them in the chat. Yep. Any other questions, Amanda?
And then there's someone that's wondering the best way to repair seams on pants that have split. She says that they're very lightweight material, and every time she repairs them, they split back open. So
yeah. Was this one of the crotch seams, or was it
she just said seams. I mean, I don't know. I find that when I get pants that split, they split in the seam most of the time, but in the crotch. But she says backside.
Backside. I'm not really sure. I know there are some like mending methods that really just like you go back and forth a lot, all like over the material where it was torn, and that sort of reinforces it. And there were some examples that Ollie showed that demonstrated that pretty well. I think some people do it with a machine, which lets you do a lot more stitching in a lot less time. But I don't have any specific methods that I know.
No, the only thing I've ever done with that kind of thing is trial and error. Just what my mom's a home economics teacher, actually. So I do have
okay. Well,
lots of sewing is what she always told me. So.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that we might be able to answer while we're waiting to see if Ollie makes it back on?
There was someone wondering if anyone has ever done patches on sweaters instead of darning it. You could, I suppose.
Not me. I do have a sweater that's mostly holes at this point that I've been meaning to patch, and I will one of these days. But I think I'll probably do the darning. I like the look of that. That's cool.
Yeah. Oh, here's Ollie back.
I don't know what happened there. Oh well. My Zoom app froze.
There you are. Okay.
I don't know when I got cut off because I was not looking at the screen.
Yeah, it was just a couple minutes ago. So we tried to answer some questions as best we could. Are there any more that you want to pass on to Ollie, Amanda?
You've also disabled my video, or you need to allow me to show video if you want that.
Oh yeah, sure. I'll get you on here. Okay.
We just got a lot of people looking for some suggestions, so I'll just start through those. And if anyone has any tips or tricks.
Yeah. Feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, and now I can't see the chat anymore because I had to leave and come back. That's sad. Hope you save it.
Someone again wants to know if anyone has done patches on sweaters, which we talked about. But if Ollie, you want to talk about that, patching a sweater instead of darning it.
Yeah, I think if I were to patch a sweater, I'd probably try to do it with another piece of knit. Well, if it's a knit sweater, I would probably try to do it with a knit fabric, like a t-shirt or a sweater or a piece of, a thin piece of sock.
Mhm.
Or yeah, I don't think I would. Well, it depends on how stretchy it is. I just try to match the texture of the patch to the texture of the fabric for the most part. Mending fleece sweaters. I had a fleece sweater that I didn't patch, but I got it secondhand and it was wearing really thin on some of the seams to the point where the fabric was giving way. The seams were intact, but the fabric right next to the seam was not. So I just sliced out the seam and then just sewed it back together. It also happened to be a bit baggy, so I had the room to do that. But that's the only repairs I've really done on fleece. I've tried to sew on some edging, like on the cuff of a sleeve. So it was just a stretchy sort of binding material back onto the fleece. Haven't had a lot of success making that super stretchy. I think the overcast stitch would probably be the way to go as opposed to the running stitch, which is, it wouldn't stretch. So yeah. And I don't know if I'm seeing one that says how to repair a pulled thread on a sweater. Did other people see that? I think what I've done, it's like best to try to avoid manipulating it too much. You try to like stretch the fabric around it to see if it'll like suck it back up into the knitting. And then if it's a big sort of pulled out loop, I have snipped the loop and then tied it off before. But it probably depends on how extensive it is. And if it's turning into sort of a run, then maybe doing more of a darning. Yeah, crocheting a pulled thread back in. Yeah, and it depends on probably how fine the knit or crochet of the material is, of whether you could like weave it back through. I have my housemate is a very accomplished knitter who has repaired moth holes in sort of homemade sweaters by knitting back into them, and that's beyond me. So you pro knitters out there, do that. Burn hole and a knife cut in the same fleece. Yeah, I had a fleece as a kid that got some burn holes in it from some camping incident, and my mom sewed a sort of embroidered patch over it, and I can show an example of what I mean. I can go grab that, but basically it's something that you could buy that has a logo on it, or yeah, I'll show you what I mean. Hang on one second.
I have some too that I'll put up here. So like this is it's an iron-on actually, but it's right. Yeah, you can sew that on and it'll cover a patch or a patch of hole.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if you have a like company sweater that you don't really want the company logo on, you can, like I did, just go get an Adirondack Mountains patch and put that over it.
Yeah, so I saw somebody wanted to see the leather stitches. This is sort of, well, this is the first stitching I ever did with leather, so it's a little crude, but yeah, this is what the stitcher all can do. I mean, this is I don't know, about 1 centimeter thick, and I did punch holes through it first, but you can stitch through really tough stuff with that. And this is called the Speedy Stitcher All. There's a number of models of them, but they're a really cool tool. And you can get straight needles, curved needles, different gauges.
I just Googled Shishiko. Am I saying that correctly? And it's really cool.
Okay.
I cannot claim to be a pro in that whatsoever.
I'm gonna have to look that up too.
Shishiko, not sashimi, as we learned in the chat.
Definitely not that.
Okay, well, if anybody has more questions, we can take a couple more, but then I think we should probably wrap up. We're through the demo. What do you all think?
Yeah, I just Googled the speed weave that someone else put in the chat, and that's cool too. So many good ideas. But yeah, that's all I have.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing all that knowledge with us, Ollie. Thanks everybody for coming to the webinar. As we said, we're gonna post the recording of this on our YouTube channel. We'll send out a follow-up email with some resources and the link to that. And it's good to have you all. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.